Hey everybody, Mark Bates here. Today I wanted to talk to you about Plush templates. In particular, I want to kind of show you some things that you may not know about Plush templates and some cool little tips, tricks, whatever. And the first thing I want to talk about is how you can test your templates. And this can be really useful for all sorts of different reasons. But I'm going to show it to you in two different ways. I'm going to show you kind of how to test just plain kind of Plush templates and using just kind of plain go testy kind of stuff. Well, I'll use the testify require package because I love that, but whatever, no Buffalo kind of involved. And then the other way I'll show you to test templates is how to test your Buffalo templates in your Buffalo app. So let's start with just a regular template here. And this is actually how we do testing for the Plush package for a lot of it, kind of integration style testing of our templates. So here I'm going to create just a simple little string template there that's hi, not he rather, but hi. And we'll say name here. So that's my template. That's what I would put in maybe say a .html file, something like that. Now, what I can do is I need a context from the Plush package. So I can do Plush, new context. And so now I have a Plush context here. There's also context with context and context with. So context with takes a map of string to interfaces that you can pass in, and that's kind of used to populate the context initially. Useful if you have things like, say, a bunch of helpers mapped somewhere, like Buffalo does. You can also pass in any old context.context of, for example, the Buffalo context might get passed into something like that, or any other context you have. So that's kind of useful, but they all return a Plush context. And now this can be used just like any context.context. So I can say ctxt set here, and I could say name Mark. There we go. And that also clears up one of my compiler errors. And now I can actually run this just by saying plush render. I give it my input, I give it my context, and it's going to return back a string and potentially an error. So here we go. I can say no error. And I can assert that the string equals hi Mark, like such. And now I can run that test and it passed. And I can prove that it works by breaking my test here. There we go, expected hi Mark, whatever. So there you go. So that is how you can test a template very, very easily. Just kind of a straight Plush template. So you can add whatever you need to the context, including helper functions. That's kind of important to know here. So let's try this a different way here. Instead of using the string, for example, we will make this a function. So if I run this right now, it's going to fail because it's asking for a function in the template, and I'm passing a string actually here. So let's change this to be a function. So it's a function that returns a string, and I'm going to return Mark. And now I can run this and my tests pass. So with these contexts, we can pass anything we want into them. They can be functions, they can be strings, they can be models, whatever we want can be passed into the context. And the same goes with the Buffalo context. And all of that gets passed down to the template. So if you want to test your templates, all you've got to do is create a new context, add what you need into the context for the template, and then test it, render it, and then just look at the output here. Okay, now let's do the same exact thing for Buffalo templates here. So first thing I'm going to do is use the render engine that we use inside of our actions to my advantage. So what I can do is we'll use the template function here. And what that's going to do, it's very, very similar to the HTML one. The difference being is it's kind of generic template runner. And actually the HTML function eventually calls it. And what's kind of nice about the template one here is it doesn't wrap the HTML layout around our templates. So if you want the HTML layout, then I recommend calling the HTML function, and that will do very, very similar thing to what we're going to do with the templates here, but it'll also include the layout around your template. But for now, we don't want the layout. We just want to render that specific template. We don't have to worry about the layout. So we can use template here, and the first thing this function takes is a content type. This can be anything. So we'll just say text test. Text test. Let's change that to text plain. How's that? Doesn't really matter what it is, because we're not going to care about the content type at all. This is obviously useful when you're returning web results here. Next thing we want is just the template. In this case, I've got a very simple Plush template here, hello.html. This is what it looks like, just hello name. Very similar to the inline template we used with Plush earlier. So with that now, we can see we've got two methods, content type, which returns a string, which we don't care about, and the other one is render, and it takes an IO writer and render.data, which is actually just a map of string to interface. So what we can do here, and it returns an error. So obviously we want to capture the error, and now we can say re-render, and we need a render engine. So let's use a trusty old bytes buffer here, and we can pass that in. So it needed a render, it needed an IO writer, and a bytes buffer is one, and then it needed render.data. And remember I said that's just a map here, so we can say name is Mark. Now let me just make sure, yep, go imports always imports the wrong package here, so I apologize. I always have to fix that. And that is go buffalo render. There we go. Now I can assert, obviously there is no error. And then I can assert, that's our result equals what we expect, which is hello Mark, and then I believe there's a new line at the end of that. And we can match that against the string. I'm going to run this here on the command line so that we can... I also changed the name of the tests, by the way, just to make them easier to run individually on the command line. So this syntax here, for B is a local mapping, but it's buffalo test -v, so I can see the verbose output, -m lets me run stuff in a suite. The thing I want to run, the regex pattern I want to run is buffalo templates, and I want to just run it in the actions package because that's the only place I have tests here. So when I run this, let's see what happens here. My tests pass, and we can verify that my tests pass if I remove that new line there. And there we go. So I was able to test my templates now in isolation. What's kind of cool with this is things like partials work. Again, I can map, functions in here, any function I want. And what's really cool is anything I put in my helper map is going to also show up in those templates. So if I have, say, that the time, right, I'll put a little helper called time. And all that's going to do is return time.now, like this. Fantastic. And now, oops, wrong file. This is the right one. I can access that time function. And when I run my test, now my tests are going to blow up because the output no longer matches here. But you see that I was able to access it even in my test. I got all my global helpers that were registered with the Buffalo render engine. So that's, I think, pretty cool. And it wasn't that difficult to, like I said, test my templates here in either case, whether it be a straight up Plush template or a Buffalo template. I'm able to kind of execute both of them in almost the exact same way that they're executed within our applications, or whether it be a Buffalo app or just standalone application that's also using Plush. Okay, so let's go back to our helpers here in Buffalo. Now, what I'm going to tell you works, again, both for Plush and for Buffalo. First thing you see here, we just did this a second ago in our Buffalo test to show that there is this time we have access to this information now. But notice that I just mapped time.now. I didn't do anything like that. If I had done that, that would actually insert the value of the time.now, and that would forever be the time in all of our templates for as long as the app was running. So that's not what we wanted. We could just map the function like this. Occasionally, I will see people do something like this. And then they go return time.now. And that does exactly the same thing as that kind of one-liner we had. So if you have functions that are just returning the result of another function, you don't have to do that. You can just map the function directly like we have right here. So that is a helpful tip for both, again, Plush and for Buffalo. You can also map values, kind of global values. So let's pretend you had, say, some sort of a build version here, all right? And that's going to be v1 like that, okay? And yeah, that's right. Oops, sorry, down here, yeah. So that's great. You can access that build version now in your actions anywhere inside your other Go packages. But what about inside your templates? Maybe you really want to render that information into your templates. This is where you would do that. And you could do this again. In Buffalo, you would do it here. In Plush, I will show you in just 1 second. So here, I can just say build version, build version. And now that's it. I have access to build version in both my Go code and in my template code. I didn't have to write any functions or wrappers around it. And this doesn't even have to be a string. Remember, I can put anything I want in there. So I can do assets box, right? And pass in my assets box. And now in my templates, I can say assets box dot string and then give it the name of an asset, and we can then get access to it inside of our template. So let me just change this here to assets box dot string, and then I know there's a robots dot txt in my public directory, and then let me run my tests here. And as you can see, my tests fail because I'm not expecting the output, but you can see that the robot.txt information is in my template. So again, fun things you can do when you're mapping stuff into your templates. And again, I can do this in any way I kind of want to, whether this is in a controller, an action. I can mount this sort of information, and that's kind of a per request type of information. In Buffalo, if I mount helpers or values, kind of constants, what you will, into this helpers hash here, helpers map, that's kind of doing the same thing as what I'm doing in context, but now I'm passing it down for every single template in our system. And for Plush, really, this is kind of a wrapper around the Plush. If I look over here, Plush helpers map here. See this helper map here? And here you can add, again, all those same things. You can add that map if you want to, or that key value pair, and that's going to apply to every Plush helper, every Plush template you run through the Plush package. So if you're doing things not using Buffalo, that's kind of how you would do it, how you would add those global constants, those global helpers, kind of those global kind of variables and stuff to all of your templates, just by calling plush.helpers, much like we have the render helpers in Buffalo. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about here, I'm just going to clean up my tests so that they pass again. The last thing I want to talk about is testing of helpers. This is another question I get all the time. So let's say I have a helper here. I'll just call it my helper, and it's a very simple helper. It returns a string, oops, here we go, and return hello. So that's my helper, right? So now people ask me, how do I test this? And what they end up doing is kind of jumping through quite a few hoops to do it. They'll do something kind of like this. My helper dot func, and that returns a string, and then they can call it, and they get the string, and then you can say, you know, that I'm expecting to get hello out of S. Let's run that and see what happens when I do. There we go. So that passes. So that's one way. I would say that that's the more difficult way to do that. Instead, what I would do is something like this. My helper, and have that return the string. And there you go. You say hello. And instead of mapping a function here, I can instead map that. And now I don't have to do any of this fancy stuff. I can delete F entirely, and I can say my helper. And now I can call that directly. I don't have to deal with that map or anything that complex. And now let's look at how error values are handled, or rather how Plush handles multi-argument return values, multi-return values for functions in a couple different ways. So again, I'm just going to use straight Plush here, but this also maps directly to Buffalo here. I'm going to use some helpers here. So first helper I'm going to use is my string helper here. This is very simple. I'm going to return an error here, like that. And I'm going to make it nil. And now I'm going to actually have this say mark, okay? There we go. Just to help keep our tests fairly consistent, I'm going to change this to my helper, and I'm going to change this line here to add my helper to my context. So my helper, and we have a compile error down here because that needs to be there. We'll just do that for the time being. So let's run our Plush tests, and our Plush tests pass. So that's great. So you notice that in the template here, because my helper didn't return any errors, that Plush just took the first value, and that's what it uses to print out. Now, if my helper here did return an error, if I said errors new boom, and I try to run my test now, you'd see I get an unexpected error, boom. So Plush knows if your functions return an error, then the template's going to error out for you here. So that's, I think, useful information to understand when you're building your functions. So it's always helpful to return errors from your templates. So while we're on the subject of multiple return arguments, let's change our helper here to return a string and an int. Now I'm just going to delete that function here because I don't need that anymore. So let's see what happens when my helper gets run now inside of my Plush template here. Again, still fine. And the reason is, in this particular case, Plush has to make a decision. What is it going to render? And it actually renders the very first argument. And that's about it for our quick look at some of the advanced ways that we can work with Plush for testing and custom functions and helpers and values and such. So that's really about it. I really hope this helps. Thanks a lot. This video was brought to you by Gopher Guides. If you're an organization, conference, or user group that is looking for Go training, please visit gopherguides.com. All training is custom designed to match your educational needs.